Yes.
Going to the worst case scenarios, if the regime, will Russia and China let the regime fall, and how far would their support go relative to the 12-day war?
Well, I wondered when you would finally ask that, because that's the most important question. And it's a question that none of us can answer easily. My personal view, having looked carefully at the Russian side, is the Russians will not intervene unless they think the regime is in danger of collapsing. At that point, they would intervene, and they would tell us before they did it. I think the Chinese are similar. And the Chinese, of course, also have enormous financial power. We're in a very fragile position right now with regard to our bond market and our looming debt and our inability to service it. The Chinese can do a lot of things to us financially they have not done. They have not dumped all of the debt that they control right now. If they dumped all the treasury bonds that they've accumulated, that's something like 700 billion. That would be catastrophic for us. So I think there are other things that the Chinese are thinking about. But the Russian side doesn't want the disintegration of Iran any more than the Turks. And I would also worry about the Turks. So if one of the things I try to tell people is people in the region are beginning to understand something. Israel wants absolute hegemony over the region. Now, the Arab states can't do a great deal about that. I mean, they just don't have the military power, the wherewithal to oppose it. But the Turks do. And the Turks are not happy about what the Israelis have been doing for the last couple of years. To put it mildly, they are enraged. If you go to Istanbul, you should visit this museum, which is all about the Gaza atrocity. It's shocking, and it's very good, and it's very upsetting. And Turks move through that on a routine basis. The Turkish population would support war with Israel. So if things get very bad, the Turks might well come into this. Now, the Israelis will say, oh, no, Erdogan, he's a fence sitter, he'll never do anything. But the Turks also are beginning to figure out that after the destruction of Iran, they're probably next on the menu. All you have to do is look at the potential for a collision between the Israelis and Turks in Syria to understand that, or a collision at sea. The Israelis want absolute dominance. The Turks don't misunderstand that. They understand that very clearly. And if you think you're next on the menu, how long do you wait before you act? I don't know.
So China's strategy will be economic warfare. Turkey is the wild card here. We're not sure how they'll respond, especially with the geopolitical chess they're playing with Israel and Syria. But then how would Russia interfere? What would be their, if the regime is about to fall? You're saying they would interfere militarily or purely economically?
They would do what they can economically anyway, but they would not hesitate to use military power against us on a limited basis. They don't want a war with us, but their view of us is that we are increasingly unpredictable, unstable, and dangerous. And they have concluded that at some point they may have to face us. Now, right at the moment, they're focused on Europe because they still think that President Trump is the last reasonable man in NATO. I think they're delusional, but that's what they believe. So that's a good thing in the short run. But will they stand by and watch Iran utterly destroyed? They place too much emphasis on the One Belt, One Road as a road to prosperity and enrichment. They place a great deal of value on their southern security across Central Asia. And I think that before Mr. Erdogan acted, or whoever happens to be running the Turkish government, they would call Moscow, and they would want to be sure they had Moscow's support. So I think you're looking at all sorts of potential expansion, from a regional war to a much larger, not necessarily global, but certainly larger than just the Middle East.
And in terms of the wild card, Turkey, how would NATO respond if Turkey is to clash with Israel?
I'm sure they'd all object. NATO is a debating society at this point. The problem with NATO is that they're all bark and no bite. What are they going to do? The one nation on the European continent that has a real army at this point are the Poles. The Poles have a very fine army. It's not large enough. It would not achieve victory against the Russians by any means, but it's a substantial army. Nobody else has anything to put into the field. So what are you going to do? Threaten to use a nuclear weapon? Well, that's a losing proposition with the Russians. By the way, there's something that we might mention just here at the end, and you might ask others about this, and that is the 5 February suspension. And that suspension has to do with the START treaty, Strategic Arms Reductions talks. The Russians have told us that they're willing to extend the treaty, and they have said they'll stay within these limits, at least until we sit down and negotiate a future. We haven't really responded. And if that lapses, then there are no constraints whatsoever on the Russians in what they may or may not do with their nuclear arsenal. And given what we've seen with the Oreshnik as evidence for very high technology in the world of missiles, I shudder to think what they might do in the absence of the treaty. So I'm someone that thinks we should contact them and agree to extend it, and then also follow up at some point with negotiations, which will obviously take months, just as they did before. But I think it's in our interest to do so. Again, when you ignore this, that sends another signal to the Russians, Mario, which is not a good one. They may interpret that as malevolent, that there is actually some readiness in Washington to play a high stakes game with nuclear weapons. That's too dangerous to contemplate, in my view.
Well, the last topic or question I want to ask you is about what a fall or military strike on Iran would mean for Ukraine and for Taiwan. What would that do to the negotiations when it comes to Ukraine? Wouldn't it just empower Russia and weaken the US and NATO? And then wouldn't it also empower China to do the same thing that the US did in Iran, and Venezuela to Russia did in Ukraine to do the same thing in Taiwan?
Well, the Europeans already vacillate between ignoring and challenging President Trump and trying to find ways to entice us back into the war they think they want to fight with Russia. Ultimately, neither approach has worked. So I think the Europeans are coming to the conclusion, and justifiably, that they're on their own. Not completely yet, but that's very definitely where they're headed. And I don't know what that means, because the Europeans have to figure out what that means. But NATO as such, I think, is scheduled for extinction. That has very little to do with anything the Russians have done, because the Russians have been entirely reactive to what we've done in Ukraine. Now, as far as Ukraine itself is concerned, I think the Russians are going to terminate this war on their terms. Right now, they have another large battle of encirclement going on just east of Zaporozhye in southeastern Ukraine. There's not much left after this. There isn't much left as it is anyway, but there will be almost nothing left. Then the ball is, so to say, in Mr. Putin's lap, and he's got to decide what he wants to do, because the Europeans, frankly, can't do anything about it. This is the sad part. He would talk to them if they talked to him, but they have been unwilling to do so, in which case the Russians may then say, we have no choice. We've got to cross the river, go down to Odessa, seize control of Kharkov, and then turn ultimately back on Kiev. So we'll see. But these are real possibilities this year to finally end the war on terms that the Russians will accept. Taiwan is an entirely different animal.